In this episode, SBI Managing Partner Tony Erickson is guest hosting and is joined by JD Miller, author of the newly released CRO's Guide to Winning in Private Equity. The two explore the critical role predictability plays in achieving consistent growth and the impact of prioritizing predictability across all levels of an organization. Their discussion highlights the importance of implementing tailored solutions and frameworks for improved forecasting accuracy when trying to predict outcomes.
JD, how are you today?
I'm great. How about you, Tony?
Doing well. Hey, thank you for taking the time to join us on our podcast today. For our audience, my name is Tony Erickson. I am a managing partner here at SBI. And today I am joined by JD Miller, author of the book, The CRO's Guide to Winning in Private Equity. So welcome, JD. Congrats on the new book. And, I'm so excited for you to join us here today.
I'm excited to be here with you. It's always great conversations with SBI.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I have to remind our audience, as we're sort of kicking this off, the last time you and I got together, it was, the day I got my signed glossy. So, I actually have that neatly on my desk and I was waiting for the opportunity, but now I can say that I knew JD before he was a best-selling author and I've got signed documentation to prove it. So
that's fantastic. I'm glad
thank you for joining us today. So tell us a little bit about the book and, why you authored it.
Yeah, thanks. So I've spent the last 25 years working in B2B tech companies. I began as a solutions engineer and worked my way up through the ranks. I've been CRO a bunch of times. I've been through 6 private equity exits. And now I work as an advisor for 5 Arrows Capital Partners. And I find that as I work with our portfolio companies and our CROs, they're always looking for advice and templates and best practices on the same kinds of questions. And so I said, it'd be great to put this into a book so that I've got a starting place that not only 5 Arrows folks can use, but everyone else in my network who faces similar challenges.
Well, that is awesome. And I'm glad that you took the time to write some of these things down, having had the pleasure of working with you on multiple occasions during our time here at SBI. It's really valuable to get some of this stuff on paper. So thank you for doing that.
Well, I think you'll recognize some ideas come from you and your guidance as well. So thank you for your contributions.
No pride of authorship here. Just, let's check the footnote details and make sure. All right. So, first question about this. So in your book, one of the big topics and the topic of this first session in our 3-part podcast here is around predictability. So, the role of predictability in achieving consistent growth. How do you define predictability and why is it so vital in these fast moving business environments?
That's a great question. So, I talk a lot about the importance of being able to guide people on where the business is going to go. With private equity, they buy a company. It hopefully has good bones, but they also know that there are things that need to get fixed, that if you can address them, will make the company more valuable further down the line. And I kind of marry that with a really troubling statistic that the average CRO's tenure is about 18 months in the seat. And so, a lot of people say, oh, that's the head of sales. They must be losing their job or getting fired because they didn't hit the number. And instead, I actually believe it's not about that. If you think about the environment that these, PE CROs are working in, often they've been put in place to fix something that wasn't working that well. They're coming into a team that might have some struggle and might have some time to go before they're going to be able to start hitting the number. And so I often think it's less about being able to hit the number right away and more about being able to explain to your board and explain to your leadership team and explain to your sellers when you're going to hit the number. And in the meantime, what are you going to achieve? With time and with foresight, we can kind of weather any storm. If I come tell you we've got an annual plan that calls for $100 million and we're only going to do 96 million, if I tell you that early enough, it gives you and your board and your investors and everyone time to adjust to that. If I don't tell you that, if I continue to promise we're going to get 100 million and then it falls through at the last minute, everyone's in a world of trouble. So I always say predictability is the most important skill that a CRO has in order to help the rest of their team survive and do well.
Yeah. And, it's fascinating when you double click into that, right? Because one of the things that as a CRO, especially in larger companies as they scale, you got to strike a balance between, trusting what's being rolled up and people's tendency to have or not have certain amount of fidelity and rigor within what's being rolled up to you. So how do you actually strike as a leader of a large or, growing organization? When do you listen to what's being rolled up versus when do you strike in your intuition or management judgment per se?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I really try and predict or forecast in a couple of different ways. I think it's really important for all of my sellers to have a weekly cadence with their frontline manager to talk about their individual deals. And I like to say, what's the date we think it's going to close? Are we committing for it to close? Is it a best case that it's going to close on that date? Or is it just a deal that we're tracking that they're going to decide on something on that date, but we don't think we're going to win it? And so our individual sellers every week are making a commitment and a best case forecast to their manager. And then the manager and I are sitting down on a weekly basis and we're having that same kind of discussion. Now, one of the little secrets is the managers aren't often committing exactly what their sellers are. And I tend to put a little bit more credibility on whatever number the manager is reporting. But it's still a good exercise for all of us to go through because it forces really clear conversations about what are the structures of the deals. We use a sales methodology that's based on MEDDICC. What are the 5 MEDDICC questions or 10 MEDDICC questions? Where are we doing well? Where are we not? And how is that driving a win? And then finally, we hear a lot about AI these days, and there are some great technologies that can tag onto your Salesforce system or your CRM tool, and it can create the appropriate handicap for each of your sellers and look at things like JD's always a sandbagger and his deals come in 3 weeks later and only 80% of what he promised. Well, Tony is always, closes things early and much bigger than he promised. And so I think when you're running the business, increasingly we're seeing that the AI forecast is the most accurate. I use a tool that's been able to get me, 98, 99% of how the quarter is going to end, usually by the second week of the quarter. But I still think it's really worthwhile for the managers and I and our sellers to go through the rigor of having that commitment discussion because it's teaching us all sales skills that are going to make us better at understanding our deals and what's happening in the business.
Okay. So it's funny that you use that example and you pandered to me by acting like I was, in any way going to be reliable. Because if you remember, this photo was a result of something that was not approved by the board, but we needed to start the work. So I was the sandbagger. I missed the date, but we did not miss the project. We got started on time because, sometimes details get in the way.
You know what? You started that project on time. You finished early, and we got a great result out of it. So,
Well,
I'm glad I can sign a contract on a headshot. SBI future clients, one to keep in your mind when you're negotiating.
I
with
ran
Tony.
into some rev rec issues on that one, but that always happens. So, but getting into that kind of stuff, right? When you're getting into, you're working through relationships, you're trying to predict and you're trying to signal and, whatever it is that your company is selling, you're trying to deal with resources and deploying. So, you'd mentioned things like MEDDICC, you'd mentioned using tools like AI. But when you think about all those issues, one that you touched on was competition. Hey, it's going to happen on January 28th. We just don't know because it's still competitive. What are some of the other common issues when you're trying to predict? I mean, you've always got competition, but what else do you have to predict and how do you overcome them?
So, I really like, and Tony, as you know, you've worked with me on lots of sales playbooks. I really like to have developed a list of about, 9 or 10 questions that I think every deal in my 25 years have gotten derailed on. And so I've sort of baked into all of our processes, asking each of those 10 questions. So
Mhm.
what's the ROI of the project? Does it have one? Who's our executive sponsor? Who owns the budget? How are they going to make their decision? What are the political influences of that decision? Once someone has said yes, back to your headshot, what's the legal process that you need to go through between verbally saying yes and actually being able to put pen to paper? Because sometimes that takes 3 or 4 weeks. And so I think it's really important for us to look at all of those pieces and have really, clear discussions about them in each of our deals, because it's going to inform, is the deal going to close at all? When's it going to close? Or what kind of work has to get done?
Yeah. That's interesting because you're right. When it's competitive, it's always different. When you're waiting on the final decision as to whether or not you've been awarded and we all know there are some companies that will take multiple vendors or suppliers down to the wire, go all the way through contracting, and then it's decided, and those are less than ideal. We can all admit, but sometimes it happens. The other thing though, and you kind of touched on a few of these, I mean, getting into true sequence of events, understanding that, having a joint close plan with your client. I mean, you and I have actually been through these processes. Like, what exactly
Many
has to happen?
times.
Who has to say yes? Who will sign the actual contract? Are they in the office or are they in Europe for the week for a, kickoff meeting? All those things come into play. And, the best reps understand that intuitively and their managers know how to manage to it. But if you don't have that process and rigor in place, it's easy for those things to go awry. And then that's when predictability is no longer there.
Absolutely. And, I think sometimes these things are really cyclical. In my career, I've worked with a lot of great sellers who instinctively know all of this stuff. You've got to get to power. You've got to have a joint engagement plan. You have to have a strong ROI. But I'll see kind of cycles where all of a sudden, I forget about it or my managers, my teams forget about a core skill. So one of the things that I also like to do is, when we have these, 8 or 10 questions built in our CRM systems, is to be able to look back at the end of every month or the end of every quarter and do a little lessons learned on of all of the deals that we lost, what was the commonality of them? And that might inform for the next quarter that, we're going to do a retraining on how to get, executive alignment. We're going to retrain on how to write that joint engagement plan. Not that people don't know how to do it already, or that we don't already have the materials out there, but sometimes we need that kind of refresh. And so kind of looking at the data can guide where do you spend your incremental effort to, continuously improve your teams.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And, some of the best practices that, we promote a lot is doing win-loss reviews on every single deal. And I am amazed at sometimes how lazy people can be about doing a win review event, like something that you would want to schedule. But I was surprised a few years ago. I was working with a company who was actually selling a solution to us. And on the call, when we told them we were going another way, they actually confirmed a time for the loss review while on the call to close it out. And I was like, wow, did I miss something here? Because, getting that feedback is critical to continuous improvement of any organization.
Absolutely. And I like, I don't know if they did the loss review on their own or if they used a third party for that, but it's really helpful for me too, to bring multiple voices to the table there. Because if you ask just the seller, of course, every time I win, it's because JD was a great salesperson. And every time I lose, I'm going to say, well, the product was, the product
Yeah,
lacked or the pricing was wrong. But if you can get multiple voices and points of view there, you can really uncover really actionable stuff that'll, improve your performance and make you a better seller too.
absolutely. Absolutely. So, um, one of the things I think we would also want to talk about is how do you ensure that predictability is prioritized across the organization? Because, varying levels of the organization have different fires that they're constantly working on. So how do you create the emphasis across the whole organization to really be thinking predictable versus just whatever it takes to win, at any cost?
Yeah. So I've been really fortunate that I've had really strong RevOps professionals on my team. And I know you've worked with putting some of those systems in place too. And one of the things that becomes core to my management style is to have a weekly flash report that comes out where the roll up of all of this information is communicated to all of our stakeholders, but also we're rolling up kind of the history of how that's moved over time. So every week, my team is making a best case commitment and a commitment and a best case number, and then a forecast somewhere between that. And we're not just communicating on Wednesday, oh, it's going to be $23 million. We're actually showing how that commitment or how that forecast has hopefully increased over the last couple of weeks. Maybe it's decreased, and that's going to drive some conversations for us too. So capturing the data, knowing what you're going to measure, communicating it to everyone, and communicating the trends over time helps keep us kind of focused there. And then from a motivation perspective, I always like to have competitions with my team members. And so, I think a lot of us who work in SaaS are used to seeing, every deal closes on the last day of the month and especially the last day of the quarter. And that's all about people and their behavior. There's nothing magical that says March 31st is the day that business needs to get done. So often we'll have competitions around, who can retire 2/3 of their number 2 months into the quarter, or, who gets to the end of the quarter closest to the pin on what they committed or what they forecasted from the beginning. And, they don't have to be big kind of rewards. A lot of times it's a trophy or a nice dinner out with somebody, but that can really kind of drive the incremental effort from people to pay attention to the skills that you think are important.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting hearing you talking about that, because when you think about accuracy and forecasting, it all comes down to discipline. I mean, that is what it is. And in just about any facet of our life, right? Whether it's health, whether it's, eating, whether it's, everything requires a level of discipline, no different from forecast accuracy and predictability. If the discipline is there, you will see the result. And this is something that I would direct our audience to. We've got a couple of job aids out there that we'll make available following this podcast, but it's that constant reminder. You cannot be maniacal enough about doing it, because you never want to catch anyone by surprise on forecast. Up or down, good news does not get, bad news doesn't get better with age, right? That's the old adage, and that's what applies to forecasting for sure in our roles.
That's right. And this is what I love about the private equity context too, is that a private equity owner, has the good fortune to work with a business for a few years, but it's often a defined length of time, or, there's a visibility that this is going to be a 4 or a 5-year relationship. And so they want to maximize the value out of that business in that short amount of time. If you're, I always talk about kind of the Goldilocks of forecasting. If you're overpromising and you're not delivering, you get yourself in big trouble really quickly. Yeah. But the same is true if you're underpromising and you're constantly, finishing your quarter with a surprise couple of $1 million, because that was investment that they could have made in the business on new product or additional people or something that would grow the business, that we're missing out on until we know that dollar's really in. So, I kind of carry around in my bookshelf, copies of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And we're always talking about not too big, not too small, not too hot, not too cold, but getting it just right. And I think that's, the key to actually CRO longevity is developing a reputation for being the person who can do that.
Absolutely. And, CRO longevity is all relative, right? When you talk about the average being between 18 and 24 months, that statistic you threw out at the beginning. So no doubt is an art that meets science to drive predictability. So with that, JD, thank you. Thank you for joining us and sharing insights from the book on the importance of predictability in business. And during our next podcast of this 3-part series, we'll be discussing the significance of board meeting prep and communication with the board. So I hope our audience will tune in. And JD, we look forward to having you on the next episode.
Thanks for having me.
Visit SBIgrowth.com to read SBI's latest research, join upcoming events, or learn about SBI's GTM services. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and connect with us on LinkedIn.